In the shadows of a forgotten Virginia plantation from 1854, a horrifying secret lay buried beneath the manor house for over a century. Young Samuel, born with albinism to enslaved parents, was considered a cursed omen by his master and vanished from all official records. When construction workers discovered a sealed cellar in 1923, they unleashed something that defied explanation. Those who ventured inside reported finding more than just bones. They found evidence of unspeakable experiments conducted in darkness, where a child's screams echoed through stone walls for years. Now, nearly 2 centuries later, historians have pieced together fragments of a story so disturbing that 3 separate investigations were buried by local authorities. Chapter 1. The Cursed Discovery. 271 years ago, in an isolated plantation deep within Virginia's tobacco country, military correspondence and county records mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. The Whitmore family had vanished from official documentation, but not from the oral memory of the local community. Their absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed. Before continuing, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we uncover secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The year was 1854, when young Samuel was born on the Whitmore plantation, 20 miles south of Richmond. His birth was recorded not in celebration, but in horror. The child emerged with skin pale as moonlight and eyes the color of winter sky. In a world where enslaved people were already considered property, Samuel represented something far worse in his master's twisted mind, a supernatural curse upon the plantation. Master Jonathan Whitmore, a man whose cruelty was whispered about in neighboring counties, saw Samuel's albinism as divine punishment for some unnamed sin. The child's condition, medically unexplainable to the ignorant minds of 1854, became a source of superstitious terror that would seal the boy's fate in the most horrific way imaginable. Samuel's parents, Esther and Moses, watched helplessly as their infant son was torn from their arms on his 3rd day of life. Whitmore declared the child touched by evil and ordered him removed from the slave quarters immediately. What followed was a disappearance so complete that Samuel's name was struck from every plantation record, as if he had never existed at all. For weeks, Esther and Moses heard the faint sound of crying echoing from beneath the manor house. The other enslaved people whispered of seeing Whitmore descending into the cellar at odd hours, carrying strange bottles and metal instruments. But as days turned to months, even those haunting sounds faded into silence, leaving only the weight of unspeakable dread hanging over the plantation like a funeral shroud. The truth about what happened in that cellar would remain buried for nearly 70 years, until a chance discovery would unleash horrors that defied rational explanation and claimed the lives of anyone brave or foolish enough to seek answers in the darkness below. Chapter 2. The Master's Obsession. Jonathan Whitmore was no ordinary plantation master. He was a man consumed by a twisted fascination with what he termed God's aberrations. Born into Virginia's tobacco aristocracy, Whitmore had received a classical education that included rudimentary knowledge of anatomy and natural philosophy, knowledge he would pervert into something unspeakably dark. The plantation itself sprawled across 800 acres of Virginia's most fertile soil, worked by over 60 enslaved souls who lived in constant terror of their master's unpredictable rages. But it was the manor house's cellar that held Whitmore's most closely guarded secrets, a stone chamber he had expanded and modified shortly after purchasing the property in 1851. Neighboring plantation owners whispered about Whitmore's strange requests for medical texts and surgical instruments. Dr. Cornelius Ashford of Richmond later testified in sealed court documents that Whitmore had approached him multiple times, seeking information about physical deformities and their spiritual significance. questions that left the physician deeply disturbed. When Samuel was born with albinism, Whitmore saw not a child, but a living specimen for his deranged theories about racial purity and divine punishment. The master believed that by studying Samuel's condition and conducting what he called corrective procedures, he could unlock secrets about the supposed inferiority of enslaved people and prove his twisted theories about white supremacy. The cellar was transformed into a makeshift laboratory, complete with restraining devices, crude surgical tools, and detailed journals where Whitmore recorded his observations. Other enslaved people reported seeing him carry down strange chemicals, glass vials, and instruments that gleamed coldly in the lamplight as he descended the stone steps each night. Esther, Samuel's mother, tried desperately to reach her son during those first weeks. She would sneak to the cellar entrance after dark, pressing her ear to the heavy wooden door, listening to the sounds that haunted her dreams, her child's weak cries mixed with Whitmore's excited muttering and the scraping of metal against stone. But Whitmore's obsession extended beyond mere cruelty. He began documenting what he called the purification process, believing he could somehow cure Samuel of his albinism through a series of increasingly barbaric treatments that violated every principle of human decency and medical ethics. Chapter 3. The Silent Witnesses. In the slave quarters of the Whitmore plantation, terror settled like a heavy fog that refused to lift. The other enslaved people knew better than to speak openly about what was happening beneath the manor house, but their whispered conversations in the dead of night revealed the depth of their horror. Moses, Samuel's father, aged 20 years in the span of months. Once a strong man who worked as the plantation's head blacksmith, he became gaunt and hollow-eyed, his spirit broken by the knowledge of what was befalling his son just hundreds of feet away. His wife Esther stopped eating, stopped speaking, and would often be found staring toward the manor house with tears streaming down her face. Old Aunt Clara, the plantation's midwife who had delivered Samuel, carried the weight of terrible knowledge. She had seen Whitmore's reaction to the child's pale skin, had witnessed the master's eyes light up with a fervor that chilled her to the bone. In her final confession, recorded years later by a traveling minister, she revealed that Whitmore had asked her detailed questions about white-skinned Negro children and whether such births were common. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The overseer, Thomas Brennan, became increasingly uncomfortable with his master's nocturnal activities. Brennan later testified in sealed court proceedings that he had been ordered to bring buckets of water to the cellar entrance and to ensure that no one approached the area after sunset. He described the sounds that echoed from below, sounds that no Christian man should have to hear. Young Jenny, who worked in the manor house kitchen, reported seeing Whitmore emerge from the cellar in the early morning hours, his clothes stained with substances she dared not identify. His hands would be shaking, his eyes wild, with an unholy excitement that terrified the teenage girl. She noticed that he would immediately wash obsessively, scrubbing his arms and face as if trying to cleanse himself of some invisible contamination. The plantation's records from this period, discovered in the Richmond Courthouse archives in 1987, show a disturbing pattern. Whitmore began ordering unusual supplies, chemicals typically used in taxidermy, restraining devices supposedly for difficult livestock, and medical instruments far beyond what any plantation would require for basic healthcare needs. But perhaps most chilling of all was the testimony of Isaac, an enslaved man who worked as Whitmore's personal servant. Isaac was forced to accompany his master to the cellar on several occasions, carrying supplies and cleaning equipment. His account, recorded in a post-war deposition, described seeing things that weren't meant for human eyes and a smell that haunted him for the rest of his natural life. Chapter 4. The Experiments in darkness. What transpired in the depths of Whitmore's cellar during those months of 1854 represents one of the most horrific examples of antebellum cruelty ever documented. Through fragments of Whitmore's journal, discovered hidden in the manor house walls during a 1923 renovation, historians have pieced together a nightmare that defied human comprehension. Whitmore had become convinced that Samuel's albinism was the result of what he termed racial contamination, and he believed he could reverse the condition through a series of increasingly barbaric procedures. His journal entries, written in a neat, scholarly hand that made their content even more disturbing, detailed his attempts to restore the child's natural coloration through chemical applications and physical treatments. The cellar itself had been divided into sections, one area for observation and documentation, another for corrective procedures, and a third that Whitmore referred to ominously as the cleansing chamber. Each section was equipped with restraining devices that had been custom-built by local craftsmen who believed they were creating equipment for livestock management. Samuel, barely 3 years old, became the subject of Whitmore's deranged research. The journal entries described the master's daily visits to the cellar, where he would subject the child to treatments involving acid solutions, heated metal applications, and procedures so horrific that even the hardened investigators who discovered the records decades later required psychological counseling. Dr. Whitmore, as he styled himself despite having no medical training, documented every detail with scientific precision. He recorded Samuel's weight loss, his psychological deterioration, and what he termed progress indicators in his twisted attempt at racial transformation. The child's cries, which had once echoed through the plantation, gradually grew weaker as months passed. The most disturbing aspect of the documentation was Whitmore's complete lack of recognition that he was torturing a helpless child. His journal entries read like clinical observations, describing Samuel as a fascinating specimen and referring to the boy's suffering as necessary discomfort in the pursuit of scientific understanding. Other enslaved people later testified that they could smell strange chemical odors emanating from the manor house cellar, particularly during the winter months of 1854-1855. The scent was described as sweet and rotting at the same time, with an underlying metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air for hours after Whitmore's sessions concluded. By spring 1855, the sounds from the cellar had stopped entirely. Samuel's parents, who had been slowly dying of grief and helplessness, found themselves facing a silence that was somehow worse than the cries they had endured for months. It was a silence that spoke of something too terrible to comprehend. Chapter 5. The Vanishing. The spring of 1855 brought an eerie calm to the Whitmore plantation that unsettled everyone who lived and worked there. The sounds that had haunted the enslaved community for nearly a year had ceased entirely, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press down on the property like a physical weight. Master Whitmore's behavior became increasingly erratic during this period. Servants reported that he would spend hours staring at the cellar door, sometimes laughing softly to himself, other times weeping uncontrollably. His journal entries from this time, discovered decades later, revealed a man teetering on the edge of complete mental collapse. The final entry in Whitmore's experimental log, dated May 15, 1855, consisted of only 4 words: "The work is complete." Below this, in increasingly unsteady handwriting, he wrote, "Samuel has achieved perfection. He shall remain forever as he is now, pure, silent, eternal. No one must disturb his rest." 3 days after this final entry, Whitmore ordered all the enslaved people to gather in the main yard. In a voice that several witnesses described as hollow as a tomb, he announced that anyone caught near the manor house cellar would be sold immediately to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a fate considered worse than death. He then had the cellar entrance sealed with stone and mortar, personally overseeing the work with manic intensity. The enslaved community watched in horrified fascination as their master transformed before their eyes. The man who had once moved with predatory confidence now shuffled about the plantation like a ghost, muttering to himself and frequently forgetting basic daily activities. His obsession with Samuel had consumed not only the child, but Whitmore's own sanity as well. By autumn 1855, Whitmore rarely emerged from the manor house. The plantation's operations fell into disarray as the master became increasingly unresponsive to the practical needs of running such a large enterprise. Crops rotted in the fields, equipment broke down from neglect, and the enslaved people found themselves essentially managing their own daily survival. If this story has already captured your attention, please leave a like. It helps Samuel's story reach more people. On a cold December morning in 1855, the overseer Thomas Brennan discovered Jonathan Whitmore's body in the manor house study. The master had taken his own life, leaving behind a brief note that read simply, "I cannot bear the weight of what I have created. Samuel calls to me from below. I must join him in his eternal rest." The plantation was quickly sold to settle Whitmore's debts, and the new owners were specifically warned never to disturb the sealed cellar. The enslaved people were divided among various buyers, their families torn apart as they were scattered across Virginia and beyond, taking with them the terrible knowledge of what had transpired in the depths of the Whitmore Manor House. Chapter 6. The Sealed Secret. For nearly 70 years, the sealed cellar beneath the former Whitmore plantation remained undisturbed, its secrets locked away behind stone and mortar. The property changed hands multiple times, with each new owner receiving the same ominous warning about the cellar and choosing to heed it rather than risk whatever lay beneath. The plantation house itself fell into gradual decay after Whitmore's death. Without proper maintenance, the once grand manor became a crumbling monument to the horrors it had witnessed. Local residents avoided the property, spreading stories about strange sounds that could be heard on quiet nights and unusual odors that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. By the 1880s, the property had gained a reputation as cursed land. 3 separate families attempted to establish homes there, but each departed within months, citing inexplicable phenomena: cold spots that never warmed, shadows that moved independently of any light source, and a persistent sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The few surviving members of the original enslaved community who had witnessed Whitmore's reign of terror carried their knowledge like a burden. Esther, Samuel's mother, lived until 1889, never speaking her son's name aloud again after his disappearance. On her deathbed, she was heard whispering a single phrase repeatedly, "My baby's still crying in the dark." Moses, Samuel's father, became a traveling preacher after emancipation, but those who knew him reported that he would often interrupt his own sermons to stare into the distance, as if listening for sounds that no one else could hear. He died in 1892, his last words reportedly being, "Tell him Mama's coming, tell him Mama's coming home." Local folklore began to develop around the abandoned plantation. Children were warned never to play near the ruins, and adults crossed themselves when passing the property. Stories circulated about a pale child who could be glimpsed in the manor house windows during thunderstorms, and several travelers reported hearing the sound of crying that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The property's dark reputation made it virtually unsellable, and it remained abandoned until 1923, when the Richmond Historical Preservation Society purchased the land with plans to restore the manor house as an example of antebellum architecture. It was during the initial renovation that workers would finally uncover the truth about what lay sealed in the cellar, and unleash something that should have remained buried forever. The project manager, Harold Sutton, later wrote in his personal diary, "I should have listened to the warnings. Some doors are meant to stay closed, some secrets are meant to stay buried. But we were fools who thought we knew better than those who came before us. Chapter 7. The Fatal Discovery. On a humid morning in July 1923, construction workers began the renovation of the decaying Whitmore Manor House. Team foreman Carl Mackenzie and his crew of 6 men were tasked with reinforcing the foundation when they encountered an anomaly. A section of the cellar that had been deliberately sealed with stone and mortar that was far newer than the rest of the foundation. Mackenzie, a practical man who dismissed local superstitions as foolishness for the simple-minded, decided to investigate the sealed area. Using sledgehammers and crowbars, his team spent 3 hours breaking through the barrier, releasing a wave of putrid air that sent 2 workers running from the cellar in violent fits of retching. What they found defied rational explanation. The sealed chamber contained not just human remains, but evidence of something far more disturbing. Scattered about the stone floor were the bones of a child, but they were arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Surrounding the remains were glass vials containing preserved specimens, crude medical instruments caked with decades-old residue, and journals bound in what appeared to be human skin. The centerpiece of the horror was a small wooden table, still bearing leather restraints sized for a child. Dark stains covered its surface, and beneath it lay fragments of clothing that had once been white, but were now stained an indeterminate dark color. The walls of the chamber were covered with detailed drawings and notes, documenting procedures that would have horrified trained medical professionals. Mackenzie's initial excitement at the historical discovery quickly turned to revulsion and terror. His first journal entry after the discovery read, "Found something that ain't right, something that ain't natural. The boys' bones. They ain't just lying there. They're arranged like somebody was still taking care of them. And the smell. Lord help me, the smell ain't just old death. It's something else entirely." Within hours of the discovery, strange incidents began plaguing the renovation team. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Workers reported feeling invisible hands touching them in the darkness, and several men claimed to hear the sound of a child crying that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The most disturbing discovery was Whitmore's preserved journals, which detailed every moment of Samuel's captivity and torture. The clinical precision with which the master had documented his atrocities was matched only by his complete lack of recognition that he was describing the murder of an innocent child. The final pages of the journal were water-damaged, but investigators could make out references to the final transformation and eternal preservation. By the end of the first week, 2 of Mackenzie's workers had quit the job, claiming they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. The remaining crew members were increasingly jumpy, starting at shadows and refusing to work in the cellar without multiple lanterns burning at all times. Mackenzie himself began experiencing vivid nightmares about a pale child reaching out from the darkness, begging for help that would never come. These dreams were so intense that he started sleeping with all the lights on, but even then he could not escape the feeling that something was calling to him from the depths of the manor house cellar. Chapter 8. The Curse Awakens. The renovation of the Whitmore plantation became a nightmare that claimed lives with systematic precision. Within 2 weeks of discovering the sealed cellar, foreman Carl Mackenzie was found dead in his boarding house room, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The local coroner, Dr. Marcus Webb, could find no medical cause for Mackenzie's death. His heart had simply stopped, as if frightened to death by something beyond human understanding. Mackenzie's journal, discovered beside his body, contained increasingly frantic entries about the pale boy who won't stop crying and cold hands that touch me in the darkness. His final entry, written in a shaking hand just hours before his death, read, "He wants me to join him. He's been alone so long I can hear him calling my name. Samuel. Samuel wants company in the dark." The remaining construction workers fled the site immediately after Mackenzie's funeral, but their escape came too late. Within a month, 3 more men from the original crew had died under mysterious circumstances. One found drowned in a shallow creek, despite being an excellent swimmer. Another discovered at the bottom of his own well, with no explanation for how he had fallen. And the third simply vanished entirely, leaving behind only his work boots, standing empty in his kitchen. Dr. Webb, the coroner who had examined Mackenzie's body, became obsessed with understanding what had happened at the plantation. Against all advice from local residents who begged him to leave the matter alone, Webb returned to the cellar to examine the scene more thoroughly. He spent 3 days cataloguing the horrors he found, creating detailed photographs and taking careful notes about Whitmore's preserved experiments. Webb's medical report, filed with Richmond authorities, described evidence of systematic torture conducted over an extended period and experimental procedures that violated every principle of human decency. He concluded that young Samuel had endured months of unimaginable suffering before finally succumbing to his injuries in the early months of 1855. But Webb's investigation extracted a terrible price. 2 weeks after filing his report, the doctor began experiencing the same symptoms that had plagued the construction workers: nightmares about a crying child, sensations of being touched by invisible hands, and an overwhelming compulsion to return to the plantation cellar. Webb's wife later testified that her husband had become obsessed with helping the boy find peace, spending hours each night writing letters addressed to Samuel in the darkness. These letters, discovered after Webb's death, contained increasingly desperate pleas for forgiveness and promises to make things right for the tortured child. On a foggy evening in October 1923, Dr. Webb was found dead in the sealed cellar, his body positioned on the same wooden table where Samuel had endured his final torments. There were no signs of violence, no indication of how he had entered the chamber. It was as if he had simply laid down and died, joining the spirit of the child who had been calling to him from beyond the grave. The Richmond Historical Preservation Society immediately abandoned the renovation project, sealing the cellar once again and posting warnings that the property was to remain undisturbed indefinitely. But the curse of the Whitmore plantation was far from finished with its deadly work. Chapter 9. The Eternal Watch. The authorities' decision to seal the plantation cellar for a second time brought only temporary respite from the horrors that had claimed 8 lives in the span of 3 months. Local residents hoped that walling off the chamber would finally put Samuel's tortured spirit to rest, but they underestimated the depth of trauma that had been inflicted in those stone depths over a century earlier. In 1945, during World War II, the abandoned plantation was requisitioned by the military as a temporary supply depot. Sergeant Robert Hayes and his squad of 12 soldiers were stationed there for what was supposed to be a routine assignment. Within a week, Hayes was reporting strange phenomena to his superiors: equipment that moved on its own, unexplained sounds of crying that seemed to come from beneath the building, and multiple sightings of a pale child who vanished when approached directly. The military's official report, declassified in 1995, documented 7 cases of severe psychological breakdown among the soldiers stationed at the plantation. 3 men were transferred to military hospitals for treatment of what doctors termed acute stress reactions, while 4 others requested immediate reassignment, claiming they could not sleep due to the child's voice calling from underground. Sergeant Hayes's final report to his commanding officer described the discovery that a section of the cellar wall had been damaged, apparently from the inside, with stones scattered across the floor as if something had been trying to break out. He noted strange scratch marks on the walls that appeared fresh despite the cellar having been sealed for over 20 years. In 1962, paranormal investigator Dr. Elizabeth Morrison conducted a 3-day study of the plantation site. Her team used primitive recording equipment to document what they claimed were clear voices of a child calling for his parents, along with temperature readings that dropped by 30 degrees in specific areas of the cellar. Morrison's published report concluded that the traumatic nature of the events that occurred at this location has created a psychic imprint of extraordinary intensity. Morrison's investigation team consisted of 5 researchers, but only 3 emerged from the plantation alive. Morrison herself was found unconscious in the cellar. Her hair turned completely white from an unknown shock. She never spoke about what she experienced during the 18 hours she was missing, but spent the remaining years of her life campaigning for the site to be permanently sealed and declared off-limits to all human contact. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following Samuel's case. See you in the next video. The final documented incident occurred in 1987, when a group of urban explorers illegally entered the plantation ruins. Of the 6 young people who descended into the cellar that night, only 2 survived. The survivors, both hospitalized for severe psychological trauma, could only repeat the same phrase. He's still there. He's still waiting. He wants his mama. Today, the former Whitmore plantation remains abandoned, its cellar permanently sealed behind concrete and steel. Local authorities have posted warnings throughout the area, and the site is monitored by security cameras to prevent unauthorized access. But residents of the surrounding area still report strange phenomena: the sound of a child crying on quiet nights, unexplained cold spots along the old plantation roads, and the persistent feeling of being watched by eyes that have been waiting in darkness for nearly 200 years. The tragedy of Samuel's fate serves as a reminder of the countless horrors inflicted during the era of slavery, atrocities that were hidden from official records but never truly forgotten. His spirit, tortured in life and unable to find peace in death, remains a sentinel of historical trauma, a ghostly witness to crimes that society tried to bury but could never truly escape.